member.
Deputy Mayor Hegarat, District North St Helier, Minister for Justice and Home Affairs.
Kate Boyden, Chief Officer for Justice and Home Affairs.
Rhiannon Small, Head of Service for Customs and Immigration.
Warwick Horsford, Senior Manager, Customs and Immigration.
Nathan Fox, Head of Justice Policy, Strategic Policy.
And Scott Hall, Deputy Chief Officer, State of Jersey Police.
Okay, thank you everybody, and our panel members, Conor Labby and Deputy Porro couldn't be here today, so it's just us. And so if I start with the questions, our first questions are around freedom of speech and human rights. So, Minister, there have been concerns that legislation such as terrorism laws might be used in ways that could impact freedom of speech or peaceful protest. How do you ensure the right balance between national security, public order, and individuals' human rights?
Obviously, the Human Rights Jersey Law 2000 gives effect to the rights and freedoms guaranteed under the European Convention on Human Rights. This includes Article 10 of the ECHR, which enshrines the right to freedom of expression. This includes the freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information, ideas without interference by public authorities and regardless of frontiers. As outlined in Article 12, the island of Jersey both recognises and protects the right to freedom of expression. Each individual on the island of Jersey has the right to freedom of expression as enshrined in that law. It is not, however, an absolute right, and public authorities can impose restrictions or penalties when they are required by law and are necessary in a democratic society. And obviously, one of those, the Terrorism Jersey Law 2002 does not interfere with the right to freedom of expression, save for in narrow and prescribed circumstances.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Minister, could you explain whether any guidance or safeguards are in place to ensure that terrorism law is applied proportionately when charges are brought for allegedly inviting support of a prescribed organisation? And what oversight exists to prevent undue restrictions on free expression? Because I know from what you've just said, it's a balance there. But what safeguards are there to ensure it's applied proportionately?
Obviously, I will refer in a minute to the Deputy Chief Officer of the States of Jersey Police. I think it's important to remember that with any offence, the matter is investigated and the legislation examined as to what offences may or may not have occurred. If in relation to certain offences, those matters will potentially be referred to legal advice to make those decisions, and that advice might be fairly broad. So I think it's important to remember that when we have this type of potentially this type of offence, that there needs to be a good examination of the facts, and then a decision has to be made as to whether an offence has been committed or not.
Okay, so that's the process. Okay,
yeah, that's the process. And I think the thing is that it's like with everything, any case that's brought before the court will have been examined in various opportunities. For example, if it's a police officer that's dealing with a matter, then that matter will be brought to another individual within the police to look at the facts and decide whether or not they think that there's actually a case to answer. As I said, depending on the nature of the offence and the seriousness of the offences, those matters may be brought to the request of the Law Officers Department to decide whether or not that matter should be brought before a court, and also decide whether or not offences have been committed, or whether what offences have been committed. So it's sort of almost a dual role. So it's not purely based on the States of Jersey Police's interpretation. The interpretation and the examination of those facts will be looked at potentially by other organisations, and ultimately the matter, a decision to charge that individual would be made, and then those matters would be brought before a court, and ultimately it would be the court that would decide whether or not they agree with the facts that have been brought before them, and that would be for any case and any legislation.
So there's lots of steps of checking
There's lots of I would say there's
way.
lots of checks and balances. There's lots of steps.
But is there like an official guidance, or is it just the practice that happens?
I'd ask the Deputy Chief if there's any sort of guidance that they would seek outside of what I've sort of said.
Yeah, there's no guidance per se. The guidance is what is enshrined in law in terms of what the definition of any offence is or may be, and then obviously the minister's outlined how there is judicious oversight in terms of whether or not any offence meets the requisite level for which somebody should be prosecuted, and that would be based on the evidence following an investigation.
Okay, all right, thank you. Just one more question around this area. Minister, could you advise the panel if there are any plans to create or enhance a transparent reporting mechanism that records instances where laws with broad powers, such as terrorism or public order legislation, are used?
From my perspective, no, there isn't. I think the laws are, there's certainly, from my perspective, there isn't anything moving forward. We base, as I said, on the legislation as it is, and we look at it. So I think you're asking if there's going to be further looks at these things. Not as far as I'm aware, no.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I shall move on to some questions now about culture within the ambulance service. We've had, there's been several frontline staff have raised the issue of increased violence, aggression and stress in their roles. And what specific measures beyond the Work Without Fear campaign are being put in place to protect ambulance personnel's mental health and ensure issues are swiftly escalated and resolved?
Yes, as you've already alluded, there's been a campaign in relation to staff that have raised concerns in relation to their safety, and that will obviously be ongoing. All states' employees have obviously got access to wellbeing and the facilities that are with that, and certainly that in relation to conflict management, those matters are addressed with the ambulance staff, and certainly from my knowledge and understanding, those things have been dealt with. But I will ask the head of the service to actually sort of fill that out a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So you mentioned, of course, as the Minister, the Work Without Fear campaign, which is a really key piece of public engagement on this topic. There's also very good joint working with the State of Jersey Police, of course, and that's been a joint work stream for about a year, ensuring that we get the balance right in terms of what can be dealt with appropriately when ambulance personnel are faced with instances of violence and aggression, and where they do need support from the State of Jersey Police, ensuring that's proportionate, balanced according to risk on both sides. And that's been a good joint piece of work which will continue. Of course, it's important to recognise that instances of violence and aggression against ambulance staff might not meet any threshold for a crime. Yeah. And therefore, we've published various sets of statistics where the instances in the ambulance service are higher than the number of active investigations for State of Jersey Police, because there's different thresholds. It's really important to us that there is good confidence in the service that staff are heard when they're registering that they have encountered an instance of violence or aggression in the workplace. And one of the things that staff have been particularly concerned about is that where they've used Datix, which is the logging system, essentially it does a number of things, it's a risk management system as well, that those concerns are properly registered, understood and actioned. The State of Jersey Ambulance Service has a fairly new post in a governance and compliance manager, has been in post about a year, who has really taken that on board and shaped it and made very significant improvements in that space so that Datixes are actually being dealt with, addressed and closed. and the compliance with that is really important. There is also a programme of further training, which I would have to come back to you on the dates because they've escaped me and we haven't got them written down, for ambulance staff on how to deal with violence and aggression through a licensed provider in the UK. But obviously we can provide you with further details on that. Right. So there's quite a lot underway, and obviously it's of primary importance to us that we get that right.
Yes, it sounds like quite a lot. So will staff be questioned at some point to see what their thoughts are about the effectiveness of all this?
So we'll probably do that through the results of a facilitated programme of works we've had done over the past couple of months with a company called TCM, who were contracted by us. They're an experienced facilitation company in the UK. And the reason we went with them is because they've got experience in this healthcare space. Of working with teams on their leadership, their management and their culture. And there is an action plan arising from that, which is just being shared with staff, and perhaps something we might discuss with you at more length in a future hearing. We could certainly obviously suggest that the Chief Ambulance Officer can come to that one too. And that is really focused on some really key actions around communication within the service, a newly formed and well engaged wellbeing plan. And that actually there is much better two-way communication within the service. That came through very strongly in the facilitation sessions, and that's part of the action plan going forward.
Great, okay. Have any additional resources or training, for instance, mental health, first aid or de-escalation tactics been introduced or planned to help paramedics safely manage challenging situations?
So the planned training is primarily about de-escalation and dealing with those instances that they encounter, and in itself the investment in the TCM process and the facilitation and the actions from it is also an investment in this broad space on culture within the service.
Okay. Minister, could you advise the panel whether there is expected to be any restructuring of the ambulance service in the next year?
I don't think that that's likely. Obviously, there was a fairly recent restructuring, and that's why there was identified certain roles that needed to be made. But as far as I'm concerned, there's no further restructuring at this stage.
No restructuring in the service, but what about restructuring in the position of where it sits in government?
Oh, sorry. I beg your pardon. Sorry.
No, that as well.
Sorry. Okay. Yes. Sorry. I didn't quite fully understand what you had said. Yes. There's been an agreement between myself as the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs and the Minister for Health and Social Services that we are looking at the arrangements to move the ambulance back to Health and Social Services, where it was moved from in recent years.
Do you know when that might happen?
It's expected to take place on the 1st of July. We've had sort of the interim sort of discussions about it, and we are all in agreement that it sits better under health where they were before, and it's no secret that I opposed it going to under Justice and Home Affairs, because actually even though it is a blue light service, it clearly is a health service and cares for community in that vein. They clearly work very closely with, police, fire and ambulance all work very closely together, and that relationship will remain. But the actual oversight and the where they sit clearly is better under health, and there's been no one at all that has said they disagree with that fact. I think is the truth. And as I said, I'll make no bones about it. I was opposed. It doesn't fit under Home Affairs because it has a blue line.
Okay, and before we continue, I'll just say that Conotable Richard Vibert has come in to join us.
Yes, apologies, I was late.
That's okay, and I think it's Helen who's going to ask some questions.
I've picked up these questions from Conotable Abbey, so we're a bit thin on the ground today, so we can sort of divvy them around. So my questions are about drunk driving and road safety. which I know the Conotop is particularly keen on improving. So Minister, the panel understand that the Collision and Casualty Reduction Plan 2025 to 2034 has just been published, which aims to reduce the number of people being seriously injured or killed by 50%. In the report, it noted that there was 188 reported collisions across the parishes in 2023, with a total of 214 casualties. Can you tell the panel what the role is that you and your department have in this plan?
Oh, right, okay. Well, obviously, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the person that has responsibility for roads is the infrastructure minister, but obviously a lot of work that involves what happens on the roads falls within the Justice and Home Affairs. I think from the point of view of infrastructure, and bear with me because I'd like to explain it in a certain way, but obviously the role from the infrastructure point of view is the fact that they can certainly look at how the roads are structured and deal with any matters to do with the speed limits, to do with safety in relation to sort of outside of your schools, etc., where they've got additional not road furniture, but the roads are structured and how they're best structured to prevent those things. From a Home Affairs and policing matter, obviously the States of Jersey Police always, on a day-to-day basis, when time is available, officers will be deployed in relation to dealing with traffic matters. So that will be speeding, mobile phones, seat belts, campaigns in relation to drink driving, construction and use offences to ensure that all vehicles on the roads are safe and that they're not going to be contributory to any road traffic collisions. And also on the back of that, obviously, the States of Jersey Police will be dealing with any incidents that do occur. So that is ensuring that there's sufficient resources to be able to fully investigate serious road traffic collisions, alongside having the necessary trained people as crash investigators, scene managers, and all of the elements of having the scenes examined. So from the point of view of the police, there's obviously discussions in relation to infrastructure, having the data to identify where those the hotspots are, which feeds back into the infrastructure. So it's sort of a lot of things, but there's a lot of responsibility in relation to the States of Jersey Police. And I don't know if my colleague to my left has anything he wants to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. I think you've summarised the plan really well. From a policing perspective, the road safety is one of our stated priorities in the policing plan for 2025. So that's how seriously we take it within SOJP, and that obviously will look like us working with infrastructure, certainly around the data aspect. So our officers now all upload a system called Data 19, which essentially means that wherever we go to a report of a collision, that data is downloaded and made available into government around the plan, so we can identify where collisions are occurring and potentially identify why are they occurring. Is it something to do with the layout of the road or the infrastructure? Is it something to do with perhaps the speed limit in that area? So we can then look to take some infrastructure steps in terms of designing out any issues that may be a contributory factor to accidents. But then over and above that, in terms of the State of Jersey Police and what we will be undertaking, is identifying those high-risk locations in terms of driver behaviour and targeting our patrols in that area, or undertaking specific operations which might be targeting repeat offenders who demonstrate antisocial driving behaviour and bring risk to other road users, and also looking at the use of vehicles themselves. How safe are they? Are there any issues with the way they're being maintained which has led to an accident? So there's lots of work for us to do in that field. Speed enforcement is an obvious one, and that's the one that we undertake. Drink and drug driving enforcement, again, is another priority of ours. As I mentioned, combating those high-risk driver behaviours, and certainly drivers who don't wear seatbelts and the like, for their safety as well. and then sort of targeted interventions around vulnerable road users like pedestrians and cyclists and so forth. So there's a holistic piece of work, but that's where our focus will be, mainly in State of Jersey Police, but we will share that data so the wider infrastructure can be made more safe through changes.
Thank you. Can you explain what specific initiatives you've got within Justice and Home Affairs to deal with the victim support for the casualties of the accidents?
I think in relation to the victims of such accidents, I think there's definitely some, I think probably further work that may be needed in relation to this sphere, from the point of view that we do have some facilities in relation to victim support, but I do question whether or not there should be a broader spectrum. As an example, we have specific people to deal with people who are subject to other offences, so like rape, sexual offences, that type of thing. I think what is identified, and I would acknowledge this, is that when it comes to both serious and fatal road traffic collisions, that has serious impact on not only the victim of that incident, but the wider family, as we've seen on many occasions. And so I think, you know, from my perspective, I would identify that that's probably something that we do actually need to look at, actually the support that people get when they have a member of their family in that kind of sort of, in that kind of incident. I do think that there's maybe something that, other things that we could do to actually assist with that.
Thank you. On the subject of driver behaviour and enforcement, you've talked about some of the targeted interventions, robust legal frameworks for deterring dangerous driving. Can you outline to the panel any upcoming legislative changes that you might be making as part of this casualty and collision reduction plan?
I think there's been sort of regular updates over the years to have changed the sort of different offences. I think there's probably some things that, looking at some of the legislation, that you could make some minor tweaks to assist maybe for some of the things that have occurred in recent times, so that I don't want to be sort of too specific because I'm sort of aligned to some of the cases that are probably still ongoing. But I do think that there are some things that you could look at the legislation and make some minor tweaks to be able to make it more compelling in relation to where people don't abide by certain rules.
In terms of kind of strengthening some of the deterrents, there has been talk about seizing vehicles and turning them into biscuit tins. Is that something that you've actively considered, particularly for the dangerous driving cases?
That specific thing, not actually, no. I haven't. But of course, in other countries, if you get caught drink driving, they confiscate your vehicle. Potentially, I suppose there's no reason why we shouldn't look at those sorts of things in the future to be able to deter people. But I do think that there are things that could be done, and it doesn't necessarily mean, I would suggest, big overhaul legislative changes, but I think there's probably some tweaks to some of the legislation that would be of assistance in certain cases.
I mean, I think one of the things that's worrying is that there's been a 54% rise in drink driving. That had been kept quite low for a number of years. So what are you thinking about to address those levels, to try and bring that down?
I think in relation to drink driving, I think, you know, we're doing the campaign, so it's a regular sort of thing, but I do think that there's probably other things that you may need to consider, and it may be that at the moment, if your first offence for drink driving is a year, maybe those are things that we could increase. You know, that's a possibility. And second offence, I think, is generally considered to be 3 years and above. And there may certainly be things that you could actually alter to make it less sort of something less likely that people will do. The only other concern, of course, that always comes with some of these things is that you have to look at the unforeseen consequences, that if somebody, instead of losing it for a year, loses it for 3, potentially, will they drive actually illegally, which means they're not insured and other things. So I think there's a balance about all of these things to be able to try and make sure that it's going to work well for you, but not having the unintended consequences.
Thank you. Moving on to fireworks, recently, I know Deputy Andrews has called for stricter fireworks regulations, and I think you've previously said that although it remains on the legislative agenda, it's been paused to prioritise reform on the fire precautions. We've seen calls for stricter control of fireworks, predominantly around animal welfare and public disturbance. Can you confirm whether or not it's on your legislative programme before the end of this term?
Unfortunately, it's not on my legislative programme. It's on my legislative programme, but not one that's likely to come to fruition prior to this term. You are quite correct. I've had meetings with a number of individuals on both sides of the spectrum in relation to fireworks. I've also met with the Comité de Connétable because it's something that I think it's important that we don't lose sight of. And so I've actually asked the committee to actually look at if there's anything that they think that could help assist in some of the changes. And so, you know, it's something that we're working on, but the legislative changes isn't something that the policy team has as an opportunity to work on. So we're working with others to try and see what we could actually do.
So how are you addressing the concerns from kind of the pet owners who have fireworks that are causing distress outside of November the 5th?
Yeah, I think the thing is this is where we need to look at when we have fireworks, how people are notified that fireworks are going to happen, whether there should be any obligations under people that are actually having fireworks, whether there's any possibilities in relation to any lowering of some of the noise levels in relation to fireworks. So there's quite a lot of things that need to be looked at, which without having the policy backup for is quite difficult. But it's something that's why I've had a meeting with the kind of Comité de Connétable, because I, from my own perspective, would like to be able to see this, even though we might not be able to change the legislation before 2026, because as we all know, any legislative changes will have to have been lodged probably by the end of 2025, or at least be with, in that policy chain, in that drafting chain, if you like. There's certain things that we could do that we're not doing nothing, if that makes sense.
Okay, so what are you doing?
Well, as I said, with the Comité de Connétable, I've asked them to actually to give me some ideas of what they think would help. I've got some of my own sort of thoughts and processes in relation to what I think would help. And so we're going to come back together. They're going to feed back to me what is happening in relation to, and it may be that they'll come back and say, as a result, because I wanted to sort of try and identify exactly what the level of concern is amongst the community as a whole, because of course there's people that would like to have fireworks every single day, there's others that don't, but from a person that comes from a background of having had animals as a child, in the sphere of agriculture, so I think it's important that we look at addressing those concerns.
One of the moves that's happened in Guernsey is that they've got rules restricting the use of fireworks for around the 5th of November. Is that something that you're prepared to consider?
I'm prepared to consider it, sort of all sorts of different things. I think it's important. I think it's important that you consider whether fireworks need to all be as loud as they are, whether we can reduce that, but we need to just come up with some sensible sort of options that we can actually sort of pass legislation that's actually going to be able to address both sides of the fence, because of course what's happened here is you've gone from November the 5th to, sort of other major events, weddings, all sorts of other things. And so we need to balance the decisions that we make against the fact that we wouldn't then want to fall into a sort of a field where we might then start getting importation of illegal fireworks. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to be in a position where if somebody can't have a firework display, they might then sort of get them illegally and then have them anyway, and that will be then an enforcement in another way. So what I'd like to be able to try and do is actually get somewhere in the middle that is reasonable, taking everybody's concerns in realistic concerns, because it's not only animals, it's people as well as animals, for all various types of things, alongside people being able to have and enjoy fireworks. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I'd like to fall somewhere in the middle if I can.
So are you likely to have any kind of guidance or rules in time for this November the 5th?
It depends how quickly I can get together with it. I mean, as I said, what we're talking of 6-8 months. Well, hopefully the committee to Conatable and I will be able to do something, but I wouldn't be able to promise and say that we will definitely have anything, rules and guidance prior to that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I have some questions now about the violence against women and girls. And Minister, you recently wrote to the panel with an update on the task force recommendations. And could you give a concise overview of significant progress points, especially regarding legislative drafting of non-fatal strangulation, stalking and revenge porn?
Right, okay. I'm going to actually ask if you take over with you, the policy officer, from the point of view, he will have a better idea of where the sort of legislation is. I mean, obviously, this legislation needs to be, as I said, within the law drafting before the end of the year, but Nathan's got a better view of resourcing of those matters.
Okay.
Thank you, Minister. In relation to the three specific points, the intimate image abuse offence material, which includes the revenge porn piece, but is wider than that, has been with the drafter since the beginning of the year. We're hoping for a first draft before the end of next week, and that will give us an outline of exactly how it's going to be structured in law. We're pretty clear on what we want from that. There are some wrinkles about how you apply it from the legislative side, and we're interested to see what the drafter is going to do with it. The stalking drafting instructions are probably 95% complete. The questions we have at the moment are about the interplay, and the drafters had an advanced copy of those with a few question marks in. The question at the moment is things like the use in other jurisdictions of things like stalking protection orders, pre-conviction, sort of injunctive civil actions, and how you structure those and how they work, where they flow, how they use, timelines, periods, and this kind of thing. So that's the draft has seen advanced copies, and that's pretty close to completion. The non-fatal strangulation offence it's a strange one. It is incredibly simple. We know what non-fatal strangulation is. We know it should be an offence. The problem is, in a jurisdiction like Jersey, where you don't have an assault law, describing a particular type of assault is legislatively, just conceptually very easy. It's legislatively tricky. It's probably one of the things that's going to be scheduled later in the process, but should go through extremely quickly when it starts.
Okay, so just to recap, the stalking one, the instructions are almost complete. The revenge porn one, you expect a first draft in the next week or so, and there's those difficulties around non-fatal strangulation, but you expect it to be quite simple when it goes ahead.
We've had to schedule stuff, to utilise the stuff, we've had to schedule stuff in order.
Yeah.
Not non-fatal strangulation isn't serious, it's extremely serious.
Yeah.
But it's just one of the pieces that we're getting to in due course.
Okay, great. So the VOG Task Force report recommended an external review of how the Police Law Officers Department and the courts handle cases. Can you detail the scope and status of that independent review, including its terms of reference and timeline?
Okay, the team is now about to start to, the person's been identified, and that individual is going to soon be sending out some documentation in relation to potential people to help assist with that matter. I've seen them in the last couple of days. I couldn't give you the whole terms of reference in relation to that, but in a sort of a nutshell, they're going to be speaking to people with lived experience. They will then be selecting and looking at cases, how they've been dealt with, how they sort of flow through the system. From the investigative point of view through to the LOD. And as I said, they'll be looking at people's lived experiences of those cases. From a timeline point of view, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I've got September in my head.
Interestingly, the review is actually in Jersey this week.
Yes.
It came forward a few weeks ago, so that's actually happened. So the review is here now. The hope is that we will have something for approximately mid-year, but we've been slightly reluctant to put a hard timeline on it. We've agreed to complete the review by the end of the year. That was the commitment that was made. In practice, that looks more like mid-year at the moment, but it's just scheduling around all the different moving parts to allow the interviewer to allow the reviewer to talk to all the necessary people has made putting a final date on it a little bit tricky. So we've just been saying Q4, end of year is our expectation. There's a very real chance that might come forward.
Okay, that's good, and maybe we could have some more of that detail in writing then afterwards.
Yes, of course, the terms and reference, because you've just actually made me, and I will commit actually to the HMIC, because the part of the police was going to be coming under HMI, I forgot what the full title is.
HMICFRS.
Yes.
HMICFRS.
Yes, and that had been pushed back, but you've just suddenly made me think about actually as to where that actually now sits. So I'll chase that up for you as well, because it's only when you've asked that question I've suddenly thought about that particular element of it actually.
Okay.
Yeah, Minister Marks, I can help a little bit on that, in that we are attempting to engage with the HMICFRS to come across and do the police side of that exercise.
Yes.
There are some difficulties in the HMICFRS making themselves available to come across. So we are looking at alternatives, including the equivalent of HMICFRS in Scotland.
Right.
But in any event, we are having colleagues across from the UK coming across to look at how we and what we do in SOJP around the implementation of the national operating model with regard to rape and rape investigation and rape and serious sexual offences. So we'll get some good information from that, which I hope will contribute to the wider exercise that's ongoing. Thank you, Minister.
Good. Okay. So the 2024 Criminal Injuries Compensation Board report highlights the need for faster claim resolution. Minister, how will your department monitor and publicly report on the timeframes from submission to final compensation? And what steps, legislative or procedural, are being considered to reduce delays? So, for example, securing police and court information, so that victims are compensated more swiftly.
Yeah, I think that might be, thank you.
So the report will reflect the fact that claims are now being settled much more quickly anyway, and that's partly because the board have spent time ensuring that their process is more effective and efficient, and that the administrative support to the board is better than it ever has been. But they do flag in the report that because exactly as you said, Deputy, there can be delays in obtaining evidence and reports. There is still some points where cases effectively have to stop and then be resumed once the relevant information is available. That will necessarily happen sometimes in cases anyway, where victims of crime have lodged their claim for criminal injuries compensation so as to be within time of the scheme rules, which is broadly it has to be within 3 years of the injury. But the effect of that injury on them is still perhaps being diagnosed and understood. So there will be pauses. But I think what the board are also flagging is that there is work to be done with the SOJP and with victim support services to make sure that we're not creating pauses that could otherwise be avoided. We're planning to approach that with a round table meeting approach in the next couple of months with members of the board, with victim support services, Jersey Domestic Abuse Service and the Sexual Assault Referral Centre and the State of Jersey Police, to make sure that we're working out if there are blockages we're creating in the system between us, we can alleviate them. And also to make sure that we've got a good understanding, good properly shared mutual understanding of the boundaries of the scheme, where there is discretion and where there are hard edges in it, which is inevitable when you have a scheme like that. So hopefully that helps. So I meet with the chair of the board quarterly, and we discuss these sorts of issues. I'd say that isn't done on a sort of a kind of dashboard of cases basis. It's done on a more general basis, and perhaps that's something we should consider for the future. But the annual report gives us the high-level summary of what the board have done and their recommendations for the future, which we welcome.
Okay, so we could follow up at one of the next hearings to see how that round table meeting goes as well.
Yeah.
On the subject of the CICB, is the current budget and operational framework sufficient, do you think, to ensure that victims receive their compensation promptly?
So any delay won't be caused by budget or framework issues. It will be caused by the sorts of pauses I've discussed. There isn't a budget as such for criminal injuries compensation. There is an allocation in my financial cash limit for it, but that is not a constraint. So the awards are made purely on the basis of the injury, its impact on the individual, and against they actually use the Judicial Studies Board or the Judicial College guidance for personal injury as a standard in that professional legal area. So the awards will be determined by the board members against those guidelines, that framework, with no budgetary constraints. So the CICB awards what it needs to in the year, in the face of the cases that are put in front of it.
So that so that's allocated according to need.
Exactly. Yeah.
But are there thresholds for particular things that happen, or?
Yeah, there are. I have to say I don't know them in detail. We can share the guidelines with you, but there's quite detailed provisions around the type of injury and the impact it's going to have on that person. There is a cap though of £100,000 of maximum award. And that's why you see in the report that there's variable amounts and then quite a lot that are 100.
And no plans to review those thresholds?
It is something the Minister and I have discussed because that top level cap hasn't been reviewed for a number of years. The Judicial College guidelines will have been reviewed periodically, but our Jersey top level cap hasn't been reviewed for some time, and it's something we're minded to look at.
Okay, thank you. I think it's my last question on this. What plans does your department have to improve public awareness of the CICB scheme, particularly among victims who may be deterred by complexity or lack of knowledge? And how will the board and the department ensure that victims unfamiliar with legal or digital procedures are supported from their initial application through to final award?
So the mainstay of the support for that comes from Jersey Victims First, which is run and sponsored by the police. We will pick up on that when we do the roundtable meeting and make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that victims of crime are aware of the scheme. We're also in the final stages of production of a simplified leaflet, which will be available for anyone including things like the Citizens Advice Bureau, that might come into contact with a victim of crime who would be able to apply under the scheme. We have to be quite careful because the scheme rules are the scheme rules, and we have to be careful that in any summary we keep them accurate and don't raise expectations about things that couldn't be compensated. But that will help with wider awareness for victims. It's not something we'd be planning to do a full sort of public awareness campaign on because it only becomes relevant to you when it's become relevant to you. But we do need to make sure that if it is relevant, you absolutely know what you can do under the scheme.
I would make a point, and unless I'm wrong, and I'll ask for the backup here of my person to my left, but from my memory, all victims subject of witnesses or victims of a crime will have provided a witness statement. Mm-hmm. And from my recollection, there is something on the back of each witness statement which actually does advise that person of the facility. Mm. And also that individual, there is a facility within that initial statement as to whether they do or don't want support. And so one would ensure that hopefully that those processes are still updated and made on a regular basis in order so that somebody knows that who they can go to be able to support them. And I think it's not victim support now, it's Victims First.
Jersey Victims First, yeah.
Jersey Victims First. But yeah, so obviously that they are made aware of that, but we must also remember that when somebody's subject of some serious offences, they may not be in the right, might not remember all of those facts. So I think it's important that we ensure that those follow-ups actually are facilitated. I don't know if there's anything more to that.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's, Helen?
I've now got Deputy Porre's questions about the work permit policy. So we've got to that end of the table. Minister, you've recently published a revised work permit policy. Can you just tell us about the key updates that you highlight regarding salary thresholds, switching employers and further protections for immigrant workers?
Yeah, I'll kick off and then I'll get Warwick to just because we're coming. Yes, it was important that we updated the policy and of course that it's updated on a regular basis. We've made some different reductions in the absence periods for those on the 12-month temporary work permit routes. We've given employees the opportunity to switch employers after the 6-month period. Updated occupations and salary thresholds for long-term skilled work permits. What was quite clear, and this was actually identified through the team at Immigration, and I'll get them to just sort of give you a bit more information about it. But what we were seeing was that where people were able to come into the island and bring spouses and dependents with them, some of the salaries were actually really not capable of them being able to actually live essentially and be able to afford everything. So the department looked at what was realistic, and it's now aligned with what would be considered a sufficient amount of money under the social security law, I believe, and maybe Warwick, you can sort of just provide that little bit more detail.
Yes, so as a whole, our the changes that we made to the work permit policy are in direct response from the Welfare Scrutiny Panel's report, along with some other feedback that we received from sectors, and we've tried to incorporate that in the policy. One of the key elements within that was the lack of information for employers and employees, particularly about salary thresholds. So we've gone away and tried to obtain more realistic salary thresholds to go into the work permit policy, as opposed to having a blanket £30,000 minimum, which isn't realistic for some sort of finance and legal type roles in the island. So we've tried to be more realistic within that so that employers know what they should be paying their employees, as well as employees understanding what money they'll be receiving once they arrive in the island. The UK took a stance last year, particularly with the care sector, in putting minimum salary thresholds for care workers who are able to bring in their dependents into the island, into the UK, and it was a set flat figure of, I think it was around £38,000. When we looked at that, we felt it wasn't really workable within the Jersey environment, and putting a blanket figure wasn't really appropriate because everyone's circumstances are slightly different. So we wanted to have a slightly more flexible approach, which is the approach that we've taken historically with all our immigration routes when we're looking at dependents, and we've never adopted those UK sort of minimum salary thresholds. So we've used data that we've obtained through control housing and work type legislation on income support figures. So what a family would expect to receive in income support to be able to maintain and accommodate themselves in the island. And we've used those figures to try and work out, and we've articulated it within the work permit policy, what salaries we would expect a work permit holder and a adult partner, what salary they would survive on. And what we're looking for is for them to have sufficient disposable income after rent that is either equal to or above what someone would have on income support in the island, because these workers aren't eligible to have recourse to public funds. So we've got to put them on a level playing field with anyone else who's coming to the island, or anyone already in the island living and working here. And that scale increases as the amount of money that they require to have as savings or income above rent, depending on the number of dependents that they have. So for each child, that will increase.
And this is for the skilled visas?
So this is for skilled work permit holders for who are eligible to bring their dependents to the island. And we felt that by making it public, as opposed to being a calculation that we've always done in the background, when we receive visa applications for dependents, making it public means that people can make those informed decisions. They're not applying for visas and putting themselves under financial strife just to have those rejected.
Okay, thank you. How are your department working with Caritas and Salvation Army and other kind of interested organisations to help new arrivals settle in well to Jersey?
We haven't done any work directly with them. We have put additional information into the work permit policy. Government of Jersey produced a leaflet that goes out with all our work permit applications, providing essential information relating to the support that is available in the island, as you said, through Caritas, Friends of Africa, Salvation Army, as well as being able to go to JACS, explaining the roles there for any kind of disputes with the employer. We've tried to provide as much information as we can, but we haven't actually gone out and spoken to those groups. We have engaged with them as and when there are issues that have arisen, and we have tried to reflect some of the comments that they've made over the last couple of years into that work permit policy.
Thank you. The revised policy allows permit holders to switch after 6 months. How is that policy working out?
We've only had it in place since the beginning of December, and I'm not aware of there being any issues that have arisen as a result of that change. It is about trying to be fair to those individuals. It's something that we will keep under review, and if we feel it's necessary at some point in the future, we may look to try and have that reduced even further.
As of course, one of the issues is about a wage spiral, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's getting the balance right between the employer who may have invested significant time and finances into recruiting someone from abroad, them arriving in Jersey and jumping ship for what would be a relatively small increase in wages, therefore artificially increasing wages across that sector, which is something that concerns us.
Sorry, I'd just like to add in that part of the reason why we wanted to make it a little less stringent was the fact that we were minded that we also wanted to be in a position that having sort of done modern day slavery and things like that, we just wanted to ensure that both workers and both the employee and the employer were in a position that they didn't feel that they were necessarily tied in a sort of an unpalatable situation. So we're trying to balance both of those things, really.
Okay, thank you. In terms of engagement from outside organisations into the work permit policy, so Hospitality Association, other employers groups, Chamber of Commerce, etc., is there anything that they particularly wanted that you didn't put in the work permit policy?
No, previous engagement had been around shorter absence periods for those people on temporary work permits. It was something that we weren't particularly comfortable with historically in granting. The statistics that we were provided didn't really show that there was a need for shorter absence periods, but through consultation with Chamber of Commerce and Jersey Hospitality, it was clear that those long absence periods wouldn't work for them in the long term, and therefore we took the decision with the Minister to reduce those to a more palatable absence period that follows a pattern on the existing 9-3 route. So it's effectively a third of the time that person spends in the island, they'll have to spend that away. And that's about breaking continuous residency, managing the expectations of those employees. They do have the ability to switch onto skilled work permit employment if they meet the requirements for that role and the English language requirements as well.
And have we seen industry step up to provide a level of training and development to those employees so that they can come off the work permit and go onto the skilled visa?
We are starting to see more workers moving across from the temporary routes onto skilled. I don't know what the industry are doing as far as industries are doing as far as training, but there does seem to be a move towards trying to retain staff that they feel have the capabilities of adding benefit to their businesses longer term.
Good. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, it's interesting that your work has highlighted that a skilled care worker with dependents would not be able to afford to live here without income support.
Well, no, I might have not explained it. It's not about the income support. It's about using that as a measure to assess.
I
Yeah.
can see it's a good thing to do so people are clear and what to expect.
And I've used care sector as an
It's
example.
so expensive to live here.
Yeah.
That's what it
But
is,
but
isn't
it's not just the care sector; it's across all sectors. I used the care as an example,
Oh, yeah, for someone
but it's
working
across.
full-time.
Yeah.
and- Yeah, it's quite sad, really.
I've just realised it's still me.
Yep.
Tetra radios and emergency communications. There's been mention of an improved Tetra for many years, or alternative radio technology for emergency responders. Can you just provide us with a status update on what's happening and how effectively our communication systems are working at the moment, particularly in areas with very poor reception?
Well, I'm going to ask my assistant minister, because obviously he's more on the Tetra than...
Well, yes, I've covered Tetra from the honorary police perspective. There is a planned major upgrade of the existing platform between March and April 2025. And that's being done by Digital Services and the supplier. Some work was done in 2025 to improve on the black spots around the island, which I'm certainly aware of some of them, and that is, in order to reduce risk. What we also have is that, of course, the existing supplier is no longer going to support the current models that are used, the current radios that are used, and some of that infrastructure. So there has to be a complete renewal of what we were doing, and hopefully within that, or almost there within that, there will be, improvements in the service itself across the island. And I think that there have been negotiations with the supplier to try and extend that, but I don't know how successful that's been. Do you know?
It's accepted in principle. Originally, the replacement was due in 2025 from Motorola, the supplier. It's now not necessarily needed until 2030. So we've got time. The contract with them does need to be formally extended this year, and that will take into account some sort of tactical changes, essentially, as the Assistant Minister has said, to ensure that the system continues to work until 2030. It is under Digital Services now instead of under Justice and Home Affairs, but we are obviously the majority, not the only, but the majority user, sort of the senior user, so we work very closely with Digital Services on it.
And is that working well?
So far, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Have there been any additional developments to make sure that police, fire and ambulance and customs have fully integrated communications to respond seamlessly to major incidents?
I don't think there has, but I don't think we're necessarily noticing any gaps as a result.
So individual departments are not using their own kind of radio systems?
No, it's all Tetra.
It's all Tetra now, including the fire service and the rescue part?
Yeah.
Within Tetra, you can choose to have it in individual departments.
there's different channels,
But there are other channels that span the whole lot, so when you have a major incident.
Because we have had incidents where departments have been using completely different systems in order to be able to talk to each other, but then haven't been able to talk to other emergency services.
Yeah, no, it's all Tetra.
So that's all Tetra then?
Yeah. Including new versions of the handsets that are appropriate for fire and rescue to wear with breathing apparatus.
Thank you. Minister, how's your department ensuring that the planned introduction of artificial intelligence and other innovations highlighted in the policing plan stick to the robust and ethical and governance frameworks?
I think I'm asking.
Well, as part of the work that SOJP are doing in terms of exploring opportunities that AI might bring, we are developing internally, in line with national best practice in the UK, the ethical guidelines around how and where it should be deployed and how and the safeguards that go around that. We've taken some steps into that space in terms of some areas of AI around the transcription service, which is currently being tested in SOJP, which so far is
Transcription of interviews?
Yes.
plan?
Yes, which is working really well and has had some significant dividends in terms of time sales,
Can it cope with
which you'd
accents?
appreciate. It learns, it learns, so it can be educated with a glossary, if you like, of terms. But accents, whether it can cope with my accent might be another matter entirely. But yes, so far it's. But yes, we absolutely recognise the importance of that ethical and governance framework that sits over the top of that, and we're laying into best practice in the UK.
Policing plan also mentions a dedicated focus on organised crime groups. Can you just tell us something about the specific partnerships or cross-border arrangements that we've got in place to tackle financial and organised crime?
Perhaps I can take that one, Minister. I mean, we work closely with the South West region around that organised crime capability. But obviously in Ireland, we work with the other agencies involved in that space. The first step around that is understanding the intelligence and mapping those organised crime groups as we understand them, and those groups that are causing the most harm to Islanders. We've had some success in the last year around disrupting some organised crime groups who have been involved in drug supply. We have close relationships with the National Crime Agency in terms of intelligence sharing, which works really well. The feedback that we get from some of the partner agencies in the UK is our ability and our dexterity to respond much more readily than what some UK forces can do. So we're very quick to kind of spin the work around.
And what work are you doing with the French in that area?
I'm not cited on any conversations with the French authorities, if I'm honest with you.
Do you want me to go through that, Minister? Yeah, so Customs Immigration as a service, we've got a strong relationship with our French counterparts. We do meet regularly through different working groups and different fora, but we will regularly, if we get any intelligence on cross-jurisdictional movements or drug trafficking, we will share that with the French and likewise.
Thank you. My last question, this section, Minister, given the emphasis on delivering value for money within a very constrained budget, can you provide some detail about how the State of Jersey Police will balance their headcount with operational demand, particularly in the areas of digital forensics and specialist investigations, without compromising the quality of the service?
I think I might.
Thank you, Minister. Obviously we, as part of the work that we've done in preparation of the policing plan, is to look at our budget award for this year, and then devise a plan in which we can deliver all the services that are expected of us within that budgetary head. We've made a plan around resources in areas that don't form part of our priorities to allow us to put the resources where our priorities sit. So we're confident that we've balanced that out in terms of being able to maintain our DFU footprint and the capabilities of the DFU unit. So we're fairly confident that we will be able to maintain business as usual services and have the right people in the right place doing the right things.
Where you've had to compromise, is that going to have an effect on other services outside of State of Jersey Police?
It will affect the capacity. There's no doubt about that. But what we will do and what we are doing is we're prioritising the work that comes into the unit. So we're doing the more significant work, irrespective as to where it sits, in line with where the threat, harm and risk sits.
Okay. I just have a few questions about the prison service. Minister, please can you provide the panel with an update about the leadership at HMP Lamoy and confirm whether a permanent governor is being recruited?
I think I might get you to run on this because it's up to date.
So the prison is currently being led very capably by an acting prison governor who's acting up from deputy prison governor, is doing a very good job with his team, including having led the prison through a recent inspection. Suspect that might be a nice question, so I won't elaborate on that yet. And I have had a number of conversations with him about the future. We are agreed that the right thing to do is to recruit externally for a prison governor at this stage, but that will be on a 3-year fixed term contract. And the benefit of that locally is that it will give chance for the current acting governor, the deputy, to be further developed for that role in the future. He doesn't currently meet all of the essential criteria for the role, but I'm very confident that he will be able to with support and development and the appropriate qualification. But we just need a bit more time for him to do that. So hence the tool of the 3-year fixed term. I'm very clear with the recruitment agency who are going to be assisting us with that we need to look for the right candidate who can bring their broader experience in a prison service elsewhere, and really have a very clear set of objectives to support and develop the leadership of Lemoy Prison, to obviously leave it in a better state than they found it, but to continue to evolve it in its journey. And of course, they'll have a set of objectives around the inspection outcomes as well. We haven't launched that recruitment yet. We're due to do so in the next few weeks. And I would therefore expect to have someone in post towards the end of the year, taking into account recruitment process and notice period. I'm very keen when we do that we have a proper familiarisation process for candidates. So they come to the island for a day before we interview them. They meet with me, potentially with the minister, with the management team, with the acting governor himself, see the prison, and properly get a feel for the challenge that they would be taking on. And then we will put them through a normal Jersey Appointment Commission overseen interview process.
Okay, and was there any particular reason for the delay for that in that process having started?
It's just, to be honest, I haven't rushed it. It's just taken some time. I was keen for Archer and the team to re-establish themselves and be clear that their first task was to do the inspection. And then it's just taken a bit of time in the new year to get the approvals and things lined up, which I'm comfortable with because, as I think is the minister, as I say, Archer and the team are doing a good job in the short term, and there isn't a rush. But I do think what I've described is the right thing to do strategically for the slightly longer term.
Okay, so now I'll move on to the report. And there were a couple of priority concerns. One was around the use of data and improvements needed in that. And another one was about purposeful activity, which I think was around work training and education and so on. So what actions will be taken to address these two priority concerns?
Right, in relation to obviously the educational part of it, discussions will happen with the Education Minister. What we obviously need to do is ensure that whilst people are in the prison, that they have structured activity education, and so therefore we need to be able to offer them a broad breadth of training, because obviously we need to look at the fact that at some stage they will be coming out of the prison, and we need to try and help them and assist them to be able to find work when they're released. So from that aspect, there is work ongoing in relation to looking at different programmes. They've put together for 2025 another programme, but I think, you know, like an education programme, but I think it also needs to be identified that facilities at the prison, there will need to be continued work and investment in the actual prison estate itself, because obviously we need to have new facilities to be able to deliver some of this training. So there's a number of things that are ongoing. As I said, that's one of the biggest things is that they need to have access alongside with Highlands College. And I think there's lots of things that we need to be doing that haven't happened for quite a period of time. So there's a plan and a new plan for 25, but I think we need to sort of try and, as I said, get in with the Education Minister to try and broaden that out a bit more. I don't know if there's any more that you want to sort of add to that.
Yeah, the other one was about the use of data so that, you know, it could be worked out what were the best priorities for driving improvements and so on. Yeah.
Do you want me to?
Yes,
take
yeah,
that one?
that's fine.
So we now have a JHA data analyst, which we've been wanting for a long time, who is making great strides, actually supporting the prison and the other services, of course, on making sure that their service performance measures and their service delivery measures are sound and fit for purpose, and that we're publishing the right ones, and that we're using the right thing as management information, essentially. So she's done a very good piece of work with the prison in relation to that. she's now got a new focus of that because we've got the prison inspection report, and she will be working with the prison SMT team on how to make sure they're getting the data they need to use as management information essentially. But there's also a stream of that, as the Minister sort of alluded to, on properly understanding the needs of prisoners. So it's what we'd know as a training needs analysis in a more work related environment, to really understand what input we can give prisoners that will really benefit them for the future. And it's been done on a fairly ad hoc and informal basis, but the inspectorate report's clear that we need to get much better at data and how we're using it to best support our prisoners. So that will be a really strong theme for the future. It'll be a theme for the current team, but it will also be a theme I'm testing when I'm recruiting for the new governor to see what their experience and ideas are in this space.
Okay. And I mean, having highlighted those concerns, I did notice in the report the feedback about the staff was so good.
Very good,
So
yeah.
that was really nice, and it must be quite a hard job as well, but it was
Yeah.
very good feedback there, wasn't there?
Yeah.
The report also highlighted that the prison had not received funding from government for a body scanner. So can you confirm how much funding would be required for that equipment?
I'd have to come back to you, I
Need
don't know.
to check, we'll come back to you. And I think it is on our list of things to do, but let me check that and come back to you.
Because I was going to ask as
No,
well
I'd noticed that too.
whether funding had been previously requested or rejected, but it's something that you're aware of, so.
It's in the pipeline, but let me check how much and where.
Okay. And could you tell us about the collapse of the previous agreement with HM Prison and Probation Services to move UK residents to prison on the mainland? Because I believe about 10% of the prison population are not Jersey residents.
Right. It's not really. I wouldn't say it was a collapse. I think what's happened is that, as you can appreciate, that UK prisons are full,
Yeah.
and so what's happened is that where ordinarily a prisoner would request being able to move back to the UK or somewhere else, that would be facilitated. Due to the fact that the prisons in the UK are full, that is why that has not happened. So it's not from our perspective or anything that's collapsed. It's just basically there's been no facility. I'm right in thinking that in the last couple of months it is starting up again. But obviously, we've got a number of prisoners who would like to return back to the UK to be closer to the families, etc., and to other jurisdictions as well. And that will be facilitated as and when they are able to accept them. So I think it's more about, because it doesn't only affect us, it affects other Crown dependencies as well. So it is about, we will, try and facilitate those as quickly as we can, because obviously that is a benefit to the prison, to the prisoner themselves and to their wider families, and obviously for them to be rehabilitated back into society wherever that happens to be.
Yeah.
So as I said, it's now started again. So hopefully that will be able to be facilitated, and it started recently.
Yeah.
Presumably it's been more expensive to keep them here in Jersey as well?
There's a sort of minimal viable cost to run the prison, and numbers fluctuate.
So that doesn't make
We've not
difference.
identified it's a significant
Okay.
cost. It creates some operational pressure, and it obviously creates concern for the prisoners and their families that they're not where they would ideally like to be. But as the Minister says, that arrangement has restarted. It was a good piece of joint working between the Crown dependencies, actually, where our acting prison governor worked with his colleagues in Guernsey and Isle of Man to make a joint approach to the Ministry of Justice to say, if we work together so that we're carefully controlling the flow back to you, can we get the door open again? And that was successful. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's caused a significant extra cost pressure for us there.
Okay, thank you. I think it's still me. I've got questions now about the Family Justice Council. So we asked questions about this before to the Minister for Children and Families, and what we heard is that any government funding for a specialist court for addiction-affected families would be more likely to come from Justice and Home Affairs budget. So please could you advise what input Justice and Home Affairs has with that group?
The Minister sits on, the Justice and Home Affairs Minister sits on the same group.
Right.
So it was interesting that was directed to me, because I
The hearing of the 29th of January it was.
yes.
Yeah.
No, what I mean is the question was directed to me at the
Oh,
Family
okay.
Justice Council, because I mean, it's very unlikely that Children's Services would fund the costs of setting up a court. And that cost is going to, you know, if that's going to be set up, then that has to come from the judiciary somewhere, from the court service. I don't even think it's Justice and Home Affairs that would be necessarily responsible for if that service is set up. Clearly, a lot of work would also have to be done to show, you know, it's a good idea, and I'm sure it can be very helpful, but a lot of work would have to be done to show what the benefits would be of setting up another court.
I think, I think the Assistant Minister's correct in so much as that this would be a court service, so it wouldn't be under the remit in relation to myself for setting up of a court. I think it would obviously be a matter for the judiciary from the point of view that they already have significant courts, and they quite often are having, you know, difficulties in actually managing the courts that they have already ongoing. So I think it's obviously something that will continue to be discussed at the Family Justice Council, and we are both on that group, as is the head of Justice and Home Affairs. So I think or Home Affairs rather. So I think it's something that it won't be either of us that would make that decision or set up that court. It would be the court service that would do that.
Okay, I understand that, but of course, as Minister for Justice and Home Affairs and Minister for Children and Families, I'm sure you'll be concerned about how this progresses and is adequately funded. Well,
I think more work needs to be done. It's a very good idea to set it up, but at the moment, all we have is you know, it's been put forward, should we have one of these courts? But we haven't seen any facts surrounding that.
Was it a Vaughan recommendation?
I don't think.
No, I don't. No, it
No.
wasn't. I think from
It initially came out of a conversation somewhere else.
Yeah,
and
I
then
think
it was brought up here.
Well, it's been brought up within the Jersey Family Council. I think because it's been obviously identified that quite, you know, a number of individuals that come into the court process have dependency. And so I think there was talk about whether or not there should be a specific court to be able to deal with that. And where it's clear that a lot of us might say, actually, that's a good thing, it's not something that would be funded by either of those two ministers. And it would, you know, the courts or the judiciary sit outside of having a minister. It's non-ministerial, so they don't have a minister. So quite often they will look to both the Children's Minister and myself and say, well,
You do it.
Yes.
thank you,
Yes.
Deputy Miles, that's exactly my point. And I think what needs to be identified here, and it's the same as with other items in relation that were discussed around that table to do with money and funding, and people say, well, you're the minister, so should this not be you? Well, no, it can't be me, because I'm not funded for it.
No.
So if somebody wants money which isn't currently in my budget, then somebody's going to have to give me that money. And sometimes it's very difficult because, of course, there will be also charitable organisations that will come to both the Children's Minister and myself and say, can you help us fund something? But I only have funding for the remit to which I have, which is, you know, police, fire, ambulance, etc., etc. So I'm not opposed to anything, but somebody's going to have to say where the money's going to come from. And if it's going to come from Home Affairs, then that's fine, because the government will have to give me the money to be able to fund it. So if they give me the money, then I'll fund it. If they don't give me the money, I don't fund it. Sorry. Do you know what I mean?
I get what you mean, and
Yeah.
putting aside the funding point for a moment, would Jersey Justice and Home Affairs support the creation of a specialist court for addiction
I
affected
think,
families?
from my perspective, the same as the Children's Minister, I think we really need to know exactly what they are actually talking about before we can actually do that. Because I think the thing is, it's very easy. Let's be clear, quite often people say, well, we need this. We are a very small island of 106 or 103,000 population. And we've, as somebody's highlighted recently about our regulations, how many regulations we have, I think we need to be very careful sometimes that we don't create something that creates more work for us and then we can't manage that. So, yes, if we have an extra court, how are we going to manage that? Who's going to sit in that court? Who's going to, from a staffing perspective? So I think before we do anything or say that it's a good idea, I would want to know exactly what they are talking about. Who, for a start, how many cases are we talking about? How many people fall into this category? And we need to have full facts and everything else, because I think sometimes we do try to look and say, well, we have these kind of facilities in the UK or France or Germany or wherever, but Jersey's a very small island and we need to be very careful that we don't create too many things that we then can't manage.
So while waiting for these facts and figures to come out, who is going to produce them? Where do you think that's going to come from?
The person, whoever suggested that, I can't, off the top, I must apologise, off the top of my head, I can't remember where this actually comes from, Deputy Curtis.
No, and I can't, but I do remember.
But I think what was important to say is that if somebody is suggesting that there's a need for this type of court, then whoever's suggesting it needs to bring the facts and data as to why they suggest that's the case. Then they need to consider what are the budgetary implications of that particular court and actually who's going to manage it and how and what sort of money is it going to cost. And if we're going to have that court, is there one that then therefore doesn't need to be there? Because I don't think that there's not extra, if that makes sense. The answer to the question is that far more work needs to be done before we make any decisions. And certainly I wouldn't make any judgment on whether we require something or not, because I think quite often we end up with things that we then can't manage and can't fund.
Because we manage this, clearly this is managed at the moment through our existing courts. And we would need to see how successful that is and whether it needs to be replaced. But what actually happened is we jumped straight into the question of who's going to pay. And you know, I think I was placed in quite a difficult position there.
Well, we will look into it more in scrutiny,
Yeah.
but also I expect you will both be following
Yes,
it up more
absolutely. And as I
won't
said,
you?
you know, it's like with everything. Provide us with the facts and figures and how this will be managed and costed and everything else, and then we can make an informed, proper decision on it.
Okay, now I have another question which is to do with funding of a service. This was about Jersey's only child contact centre, and the panel understands that funding has been secured for the next 2 years. But could you advise if this funding has come from Justice and Home Affairs or not?
No.
It's coming from. I mean, I've been involved in that because I got my assistant minister to actually do the work, and that was after we had actually tried to see if we could get funding from other third parties, including from 21Es and a number of other charitable organisations, and we actually met with that, no success at all. So in order to provide some breathing space, we asked for funding from the Chief Minister directly from his fund, which he's agreed to do for 2 years, but it's under the organisation involved. It has been made quite clear to them that during that 2 years, alternative funding must be sourced. And I do go back to, I think what I said last time, is we had a judge on at the Family Justice Council who was online who actually completely backed our stance on it and saying that no council in the UK provides funding to a private law contact centre, which is what this is.
Yes, I think from the scrutiny panel's point of view, it was to try and ensure that an essential service for the well-being of children was going to continue. But it is continuing at the moment. So.
It's continuing
Yeah.
for 2 years, yes, yeah.
Minister, are there any further updates or areas not already covered today that you wish to highlight, particularly in relation to cross-departmental collaboration or upcoming legislative changes?
Don't think so.
No?
Yeah, I think we.
Okay, we've still got a few minutes, I think, so I think that's you then, Helen, isn't it?
Thank you. We've got kind of more questions than time, so we'll be putting some of these into writing.
Absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
So the last area is going to be just about your role as competent authority for gas. And could you just outline your responsibilities regarding the safety of Jersey Gas's network under the island's resilience and emergency planning frameworks? And can you just clarify how you remain informed about potential risks or issues?
Obviously, as you rightly highlight, as Minister for Justice and Home Affairs is the competent authority for, amongst other things, gas pursuant to Article 7 of the Emergency Powers Law. This provides, in respect of gas, the Minister with the power, after consultation with the gas company, that if the supply of gas is for any reason threatened, I may take such steps as I think necessary or desirable to secure or maintain the supply. For this purpose, I may, by order, make provision for example, the preservation of public safety and maintaining or making the best use of supplies of gas available. Obviously, we meet regularly in relation to the emergency planning and also in relation to the gas. Obviously, the Chief Minister's recently announced, following the discussions at the Emergency Council, that we would be bringing forward further legislation to provide additional information gathering powers in respect of gas by amendment to the gas law, which goes back to 1989. This is so that we can ensure a timely flow of information from the gas company to government and to provide us with additional information on which I can make my decisions, well, whoever's sitting in this role can make decisions as competent authority. And the draft amendment to the law should be lodged shortly so that it can be dated in April. But I believe that am I right in thinking there's a briefing to yourselves?
Yes, next Wednesday.
Next week on that.
So what progress has been made in implementing the lessons from the gas outage last year?
So the gas, there's a number of different work streams under the gas work within government, which is co-owned across a number of chief officers. We meet monthly on that. We've just formed, the Chief Minister has just formed a gas ministerial group as well. And the aim of that is to have more regular meetings with the relevant ministers, so it's better coordinated and we're not having to convene Emergencies Council each time we need those ministers in the same place to discuss it. So I think that will take us a significant step forward in ensuring regular oversight of this matter. In terms of the implementation of the lessons learned from the gas outage, which was in October 23, we've had, as you'd expect, we had the debrief process. We've got a number of recommendations from that. Many of them have now been implemented, and the mainstay of that is a gas emergency measures response plan, which has now been produced and finalised, to the extent that these things are ever finalised, because they always evolve. And that's now been approved by the Jersey Resilience Forum and has also been presented in high level to the Emergencies Council and will be sort of refreshed with the Gas Ministerial Group next time it meets. So that's there, should we need it. And we are regularly taking opportunity to refresh it as we learn from gas incidents.
So how do you collaborate specifically with Island Energy about ensuring that the maintenance, the upgrade, investigations into the gas pipelines are carried out safely and promptly?
So as you'll be aware, there's a new chief exec at IEG now, who we've met with a number of times. He met with the Chief Minister before Christmas, in fact, before he was in post. And the Chief Officer for Infrastructure and Environment and I met with him 2 weeks ago. He's the IEG Group Chief Exec for the three islands, and then his local managing director who's actually based in Guernsey but is now covering both islands, has been very actively involved with the emergency planning team and fire and rescue service, as you'd expect. So I'm confident we've got much better engagement with IEG now than we have had in recent years, both at ministerial level, chief officer level, but also operational level. And we will be putting various sort of further structures around to make sure that that engagement is continuing. There's a number of needs for exchange of information between us and IEG, which IEG have committed that they will do. They understand the need for us to legislate, as the Minister's just described, and we can talk about that a bit more when we provide you with a private briefing next week. But we've seen good cooperation, but everyone understands that we need to have a better, a more formal governance structure around it, which is what the legislation will give us. And yeah, I think I would just stress that at an operational level, engagement with IEG is much better than it has been.
Good. Well, I think it's just come up to 2:00, so we have got quite a lot more questions actually, so we'll have to send that to you, if that's okay. All right, so thank you very much everyone for your time. Sponsors, that's